Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 128th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Grossman. You can call me Jag. I'm the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in fun, creative ways like our graphic novels and animated videos. Today, we are joined by Konstantin Kisin. Before I even begin to introduce our guest, I want to remind those who are joining us, whether on Zoom, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, you can use the comment section to type in your questions. So go ahead and get started. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Konstantin Kisin is a Russian-British comedian and political commentator who hosts Triggernometry, a YouTube channel and podcast devoted to free speech. He is the best-selling author of An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. He made international headlines for refusing to sign a behavioral agreement form banning certain kinds of jokes in order to speak on a university campus, and we are delighted to have him join us today. Konstantin, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Jag. I appreciate it.
So we always like to start with a bit about our guests' origin stories, and yours, which you share in your book, was particularly fascinating. You were born in Soviet Russia, and as I understand, members of your family tree were actually jailed as political dissidents. So tell us a bit about your family history and how your experience under communism may have shaped your political perspective today.
Well, the short story of it is, as you say, I was born in the early 80s in the Soviet Union, and yes, members of my family experienced various sort of punishments ranging from being sent to the Gulag to being fired from work, etc. And some of it was for political dissidents, people who had the wrong view, the wrong opinion, which is why free speech is so important to me. But a lot of it was just, this radical reordering of society that you're interesting. Before we started, you asked me if I'd read Ayn Rand, and one of the things I found very interesting as I explored her work in my sort of late teenage years and early 20s is her name obviously wasn't, it's a pseudonym, Ayn Rand. Her name was Alice Rosenbaum, and she escaped Russia because of the communists that were taking over. So the very things that she was fleeing and her family were fleeing were the very things that my family experienced. So yeah, I had all sorts of different experiences in my family, and of course people often say to me, well, look, you were born in the 80s, what are you talking about? How could this affect you? Well, actually, my grandfather, I talk about this in the book, as you know, he was fired from work, his wife was fired from work, and his children, my dad and my aunt, were forced out of the university because he criticized the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the mid 80s. So this repressive machine was still around even when I was a little boy. But more importantly, if you live in a family, particularly a Russian one, where we like to go over the dark and terrible things that have happened to us or that we've experienced over and over in great detail, and you spend a lot of time living with grandparents as well, in a way that most people in the West don't tend to do anymore, then you kind of get it, your whole life is infused with all of these stories, and they shape your experiences and how you see the world. And there's all sorts of other things that we could talk about in terms of that I don't even talk about in the book. But for example, my grandmother, who lives in Ukraine, she was or lived in Soviet Ukraine all her life. She experienced not only the people coming and sending her family off to the gulags, confiscating her property, exiling them to the far east of Russia because they had a horse. That was their great crime. They were kulaks and wealthy, therefore. But also the fascinating thing to me is, in many ways, that was not even the worst thing that she went through, because she then lived through the German occupation of Russia and Ukraine. And of course, now she's still alive, my grandmother, 94 years old, living through yet another occupation of Ukraine. So it's a society that has seen a lot of turmoil, and I think it shapes a lot of the way that people think. I was born there, partly culturally from there, but also happened to come to the West when I was a teenager, and so I kind of have a foot in both camps. I can see things in both ways. I often say that actually speaking a different language gives you a different personality. Like the person I am when I'm speaking Russian is probably quite different to the one I'm speaking English, and that sort of access allows me to perhaps see where, hopefully, where the West is perhaps unaware of how how things are everywhere else. I talk, as you know, about this quite a lot in the book. In the West, we've got this very self-focused view, and because we're fortunate to be wealthy and safe and stable and whatever, we don't have to think about how people live elsewhere, and we therefore don't compare ourselves, and therefore it's very tempting then to think, oh, actually what we have isn't great, and all of that. On the other hand, I can also see into the Russian way of thinking and the Russian culture and how that impacts the way people in Russia think and some of the threats we in the West face as a result. So yeah, that's my background. I was trying to make it short, but it ended up being long as always.
No, I thought it was really fascinating. Not just, your experience of being sent here for boarding school and not speaking the language, and then also there's the aspect where, just as with the Holocaust, these experiences, or just as with the Cultural Revolution in China, and the resulting scar literature, as they call it, that these experiences do get kind of passed down through the family in a way, because it not only changes those that have directly experienced it, but it also shapes what they pass on to the next generation. And speaking of passing on to the next generation, you were a teacher at some point in your career.
Was I?
Well, I thought you taught in school, or no, maybe was that
No,
Francis?
you're probably confusing me with Francis.
Okay.
I can't believe you've confused this, Jag, and this isn't, I'm not attacking you. It's just he brings it up every bloody episode. So I would have thought you would have got that, but don't worry about it. No, I wasn't the teacher. I've run a few training courses, but I was never a teacher. Yeah.
So, how did you get into stand-up comedy?
Well, it's a long and boring story, but I had a friend who was an agent for comedians, and he invited me to a comedy festival that he founded in a very small city in Ireland, in Kilkenny, called Cat Laughs. And I just looked at the people performing there, and I'd run my own translation business for 10 years before that, so I was getting to the point where I'd kind of like as you can see from the gaming chair behind me, I used to enjoy computer games, and I kind of think of life in that way. It's like I'd completed all the levels in my previous career, and I think I was ready to do something else. And I saw all these guys, and it was mostly guys on stage, just talking and making people laugh. And I, like a complete idiot, thought, oh, that looks like fun. Why don't I do this? Not realizing that actually it sounds like they're just talking and being funny. It's the ability to be that funny is the process of years and years and years of crafting what is material on stage. But I'm the sort of person that likes to challenge myself. I like to have a go at different things. And so I started, and you start out doing the open mics, and it's absolutely brutal. It's the hardest gigs that you do. And eventually, I was fortunate, and my career went very well. I made it into the different clubs. I wrote on TV. I opened for some of my heroes on tour. I did my own show in 2019, which was about that contract that you mentioned earlier. So I was able to weave together the many interests that I have in it. So yeah, it was always something, I think stand-up was never quite the right thing for me, because I was always much more interested in satire than stand-up. And stand-up is a different genre. Stand-up is much more simply about entertainment. I was much more, again, my Russian influence coming into it, because in the Soviet Union, jokes were always, of course, people just joke about it in day-to-day life, but humor was particularly powerful in terms of highlighting some of the things that were happening in society, because they were almost the only way that you could. Being funny, jokes were a way of exposing the hypocrisies and the flaws in the system that people were living in. And so Russia actually has and the former Soviet countries, there's a very rich culture of political satire as opposed to just humor for the sake of pure entertainment. And I was much more interested in the satirical side of things, which is why I think over time I began to do other things and write and do trigonometry and do other things, because while I enjoyed stand up, and there's, as Francis calls it, the joke coke when you're on stage, it's a very strong physical experience, and I always enjoy public speaking and stand up and all of those things. They're fun. When the pandemic happened, and I realized that I was spending, half my day driving around to various obscure cities in the UK to do a 20-minute set in a comedy club, and my wife hasn't seen me for a couple of years, which is sort of how she was feeling. I decided to take a break, and we'll see how long that break from stand up lasts.
Well, so you mentioned in the introduction this experience that you had when you kind of garnered international attention for refusing to sign this university behavioral agreement form. So what was it, and what was your thinking, and what was the reaction?
I'll tell you the story very quickly, because anyone who knows me has heard it 1,000 times. But basically, I was asked to perform at a college in London, and they said they needed me to sign a behavioral agreement contract, which had a zero tolerance policy on, get this, racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-religion, anti-atheism, and it also said that all jokes must be respectful and kind. And I turned it down. I tweeted about it to what was like 1,000 people at the time. I didn't have a particularly big following back then. We just started Triggernometry a few months before. And it went super viral around the world. It was the second most read story on the BBC News website on the day that the then Prime Minister was nearly removed from office by her own party. So that's the equivalent of, like, I don't know, right now Joe Biden gets nearly impeached by the Democrats, and the biggest story on Fox News and CNN is comedian no one's ever heard of turns down unpaid charity gig from some college no one cares about. It was kind of crazy. Why
do you think it struck such a chord?
Well, this is what I realized in that moment. Is prior to that, I think I was tempted to think that the reason I care so much about people being free to make jokes and express themselves and say controversial things, and even things that I strongly disagree with, was because of my background and, how I'm built and blah, blah, blah. But when I turned down that contract and it got that kind of reaction, I realized that actually a lot of people in our society feel, and the statistics bear this out, and I cite many of them in the book. Most people, even people who we think of as, like, let's say, conventionally people would say the left has control over the media, or more control over the media than the right. Let's say this is the argument some people would make. Even on the left, people feel terrified of expressing themselves in public, and on the right and in the center, it's even more pronounced. So I think the reason that it had the resonance that it had is that ordinary people feel in their own lives on a day-to-day basis almost like there are situations in which they've signed that contract. They've signed a contract not to offend people. They've signed a contract which says that if you say the wrong thing, or you don't quite use the 2022 word, you use the 2020 word, and you didn't get the update notification about that word no longer being allowed. If you didn't do that, then you're going to be in trouble, and you risk losing friends, or losing your job, or being hampered in your career, or being kicked out of college or school, or whatever it might be. So I think the reason it had the resonance that it had is quite a lot of people don't like being told you can't say this, you can't do that. And I think they're also tired of these endlessly creeping moral standards where a person who's been in a coma for like 5 years would wake up now and be a massive bigot automatically just because they hadn't been around for 5 years of new cultural norms. You know what I mean? So I think that's where a lot of the sentiment, that not just in reaction to that contract, but more broadly in our society, a lot of it is coming from that place, I think.
So, as I mentioned, your book was really beautifully written and also beautifully narrated. Konstantin does the narration himself, which I know is actually not very easy.
I lost my voice. I talk for a living. So I was absolutely like you. I thought I was just going to walk in there. I did my audiobook for 2 days and my throat was just gone. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's not easy, but I thought you did a great job. What was the inspiration?
I don't know if I had an inspiration. I had the motivation, which I think is a very different thing, because and I reflect on it somewhat ironic that I wrote a book called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, which is largely about where I think the West is going wrong. And I'm not unaware of that sort of contradiction to some extent. I just think that we've got to a point in society where someone had to say the things that I'm saying in the book, and I didn't see anyone else saying them. And I also thought that I perhaps would have, and one of the reasons I may be able to say it is the fact that I'm a first generation immigrant, and whatever allows me to say things that maybe somebody born in the West and raised in the West not only wouldn't necessarily be able to say because they don't have the outsider perspective, but even if they have the perspective, they're just not going to be allowed to say it. Publishing my book was not easy. And I imagine that if my name was John Smith and I was white and born in the UK, it would have been a lot harder. So I think that's why I felt, it wasn't so much inspiration, it was more I felt a duty really to say something. And this is perhaps where, again, coming back to a lot of my thinking and my approach to life, where it comes from is, I come from a society where people spend most of their time not saying what they thought and pretending to be okay with things that they were not okay with. And I'm not okay with some of the things that are happening in our society. I don't think they're the right thing that should be happening. I'm in a fortunate position to be able to say something publicly, and I just felt it was necessary to do that.
All right, I have more questions about the book, but we have questions coming in from the audience, so I want to dip into those. Candace Morena on Facebook says she loves Triggernometry. She says you recently discussed your views on how to promote free speech and police hate speech. Could you go into that in more detail?
I'm trying to remember what Candace is referring to. I'm not sure that I'm not sure I know what she's referring to, but yeah,
maybe she'll come back.
Maybe she'll come back, because that's a bit of a vague one, and I wouldn't want to respond to something else.
Let's go to another Facebook question from Alex Kirch asking, in America, you hear about people leaving New York or California. Is there some parallel of people fleeing areas in the UK? People voting with their feet.
Oh, that's an interesting thing. This is the big advantage of living in the United States. You have states. Well, it's big, but also the way that it's federalized, it means that states get to set their own rules, right? So if a part of the United States wants to have certain rules when it comes to, the usual help, whatever issues you want to bring up, that approach to COVID or guns or other stuff, you get to choose. In the UK, there is very little of that. Sure, you can move to Scotland. The weather's I lived in Scotland for many years. The Scottish people are nice, but the weather's terrible, and their government is even worse than the one that we have. And that's really about it. You don't have a lot of choice. So there is not a huge amount of that going on beyond the usual people moving out of cities into the more rural areas for all sorts of different reasons: crime, cost of housing, etc.
Interesting. That would be.
But I'm very sorry, Jag. Sorry to interrupt. I am very jealous of the United States. I know, we were in Austin a few months ago doing the Joe Rogan show, and this is one of the things we were talking about. He moved from California to Austin, and he's very happy. the stuff that he has and wasn't able to do in California. So I'm very, very jealous. And that's, again, one of the, I'm such a big fan of America. People all over the world like to dump on America. And I think it's quite often jealousy, because you guys do a lot of things very well. And this is definitely one of them.
All right. Another question from Facebook. What is the best way to deal with bad faith actors? Is it the way you and Francis respond to David Pakman? So I'm not sure who that is.
So David Pakman is a progressive commentator who we had on the show. And we were very happy to have him on, and we had a very good faith conversation. At least we thought that, because afterwards what he did is he completely misrepresented what had happened on his own channel, and it became very clear that he wasn't there to have a conversation. He was there to win. And so we just put out a quick video just explaining what had happened, what he did, and that because we believe in conversation, we're going to continue to act in good faith, even when people like him come on the show and act in bad faith. Yeah, I think that's it if you're in that sort of situation. But quite often you don't need to interact with people who are acting in bad faith. I increasingly find that on social media, I just go, okay, this person isn't interested in having a conversation. Let's not waste each other's time on it.
So in your book, you talk about how political correctness existed in the Soviet Union long before it existed here. Thought that was really interesting.
Well, it didn't just exist in the Soviet Union, it was created in the Soviet Union. This is my point. This is the point I was really keen to make in the book, is political correctness never had anything to do with politeness or protecting people's feelings or not offending vulnerable groups or whatever we now believe it has anything to do with. Political correctness was a way of saying to you, what you're saying may be factually true, but it is wrong for you to say it. It is wrong because it does not match the position of the party. It is wrong because it does not match the political line you're supposed to take, even if it is factually true. And that's the reason I bring it up in the book, Jack, because I think we can all recognize that to some extent political correctness is used in that way in the West as well, where it's not so much about, satirists like me mock this is the idea of hate facts. There are certain facts that are true that you're not allowed to express because they're hateful. Well, if they're true, I think we should be able to express them. And that's why I think political correctness is important to highlight its origins, because it kind of tells you how it often gets used today in the West as well.
All right. You said at some point that you almost wanted to call the book An Immigrant's Love Letter to the Anglosphere. And is that correct? And I think you talked about how the French had an obsession with reason and rationality versus the Anglosphere's sense of tradition as a source of knowledge. What did you see the British and Scottish Enlightenments differing with the French Enlightenment?
Well, there was a huge difference. If you look at the outcomes of the two revolutions, for example, they're very different. The foundation of the United States, based on the ideas of the English and Scottish Enlightenment, creates a very different type of society to the one that's created in the French Revolution, which attempts to remake society from the ground up. It thinks that everything, human beings can be reimagined, that human beings can be remade in the model of pure rationality and reason. Of course, the end result is blood, terror, murder, death. And it's a fundamental difference between those two approaches to transformation of society and structuring society. But it's also, I think, goes deeper than that. I'm a huge fan of Thomas Sowell's work, and this is one of the things he writes about in a couple of his books, the conflict of visions and the vision of the anointed.
That's a great book, especially that latter one.
Yeah. Well, they're both wonderful. And as you know, Jack, what he talks about is there are essentially two visions of humanity, to summarize it for our viewers and listeners. One vision is what he calls the tragic vision, which is the idea that human beings are flawed, they're imperfect, they're fallible, and therefore when we make society's rules, we have to make them taking into account that human beings are human beings, they're imperfect. And the other approach is what he calls the unconstrained vision. It's not constrained by the tragic reality of life, and it believes that everything can be made from the beginning. Human beings can be remade. This was the foundation to a large extent of the Bolshevik Revolution, which created the USSR, in which I was born. The idea was very much the same. Communism is the idea that you can get people to abandon their natural attitudes and aspirations in favor of the greater good. And maybe it would be a good idea, for ants or mole rats who are biologically shared DNA, but for human beings who are intercompetitive and tribal in many ways, it just doesn't seem to be a good way of doing things. And I might even agree with the sort of crazy progressives who think it would be better if human beings could be perfected, and we could make a better society, and there would be no crime and no, whatever, insert bad thing here, inequality. But it turns out human beings aren't like that, and attempts to make them like that, result in millions of people being forcefully killed or deported or forced to, to live a different life entirely that they're not happy with, and those regimes inevitably collapse. So I think the reason that I'm not so desperate to offend all my French and German and whatever other friends, it's just people often sort of go, well, you say the West, what is the West? And I'm like, well, this is the portion of the West that I quite like, and let's talk about that.
All right. Amal Sura on Instagram is asking about the difference between allowing free speech and the choice to engage with people and their speech. Is it okay if there are people we don't want to talk to?
Of course.
Sounds like you just said you're kind of deciding no sanction of the victim on social media. If somebody is just there to harass you, or if they're being irrational, you prioritize.
Right. And this is one of the reasons I am excited about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter in particular, because I think what he's talked about is kind of like the Google. When you search for things on Google, you get like no one goes to the third page of Google. So that's because all the results on the first page of Google are great. Right. So if you had a social media experience where people can say what they want, but you just don't get around to looking at it, if it's not stuff that's constructive or helpful, if someone calling you a dick or whatever, that to me is much better. I don't want people to be shut down. I don't want them not to have a Twitter account because I don't like them. I think that's kind of a high standard for allowing someone to have a voice. I think people should have a voice, but also, yeah, of course, we don't have to listen to everything that somebody says. And so any tool that allows us to allow people to speak, but also control what we choose to hear, I think that's great. And I think that would take us forward.
Yeah, and I think to extend that even further, Ayn Rand talks about free speech does not extend to forcing you to subsidize another's platform, right? So that someone doesn't have the right to come in and shout, obscenities on your lawn or in your driveway. And I think that is where we need to draw the line. Okay, this is a really interesting question on Facebook. James Kovich asking, do you think there is a correlation between those who promote cancel culture and personality disorders?
It's a complicated one because I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't want to give you my unqualified medical opinion, but yes. We've had a couple of people talk about how much of it is driven by narcissism,
right?
And I think that's an inevitable part of it. I also think that cancel culture is representative of certain ways of doing things, which I wouldn't necessarily consider personality disorders or whatever, but it's a lot of people have commented on it that it is a quite again, please hear me correctly, it's a stereotypically more female or more feminine way of doing things. Men tend to fight directly, so men are more likely to challenge and to fight even directly, which obviously is bad in certain situations, whereas women will tend to destroy your reputation, they'll talk behind your back sometimes and whatever. So I see it as also partly as a changing of who has power in society in terms of the dynamic between the stereotypical two sexes.
Ipswich 29 on Instagram is asking about differences between the culture wars, US, UK, a big talking point here in the United States with regards to wokeness. You've had experiences in Britain, but you have, gone back and forth. You have a lot of guests from the United States on your show. So how is the situation worse or better in Great Britain?
I think that the situation in Britain is quite a bit better, actually, in many ways. There is much more pushback, I think, against some of the excesses of this way of doing things. So, for example, in both countries, you have clinics which are performing gender transition surgery on children, which to me is just an abomination. But in the UK, the clinics that were doing that, several of them have been shut down by the government pending investigations about children being encouraged down that path when they shouldn't have been. So it's terrible that it happened, but at least, we're taking some action in terms of making sure that people are getting the help they need without dragging other people into that conversation who really don't belong there. And I see that as, one of the worst consequences of this culture, actually. Pink-haired idiots on college campuses bother me less than children being encouraged to have permanently life-altering medical procedures. So on that front, we're doing better. I think we are also less crazy in the way that we talk about these things. There's less hyperventilations because America is a very it's a high energy culture. When you fight hard. When you do things, you do them full on. In the UK, it's kind of like, we don't take things quite as seriously, and that has many disadvantages. But one of them is that when we do have these polarized situations in both our societies, perhaps we don't quite do that side of it as harshly as you guys do in the US. Our media is probably less polarized as well. We still have a BBC. I mean, people argue over its impartiality, of course, but it is a somewhat independent source of media. And generally, I just think, and also most importantly, in terms of this conversation, at least, is we don't have guns. So even if we do have a falling out, it's not going to be quite as bad. For those reasons, I'm quite optimistic actually about the situation in the UK.
But I think I've seen reports of regular people who say something that is considered hate speech on social media and get sideways
arrested.
With the police. Yeah.
Well, see, on that issue, I completely agree with you. This is a huge advantage of the American Constitution that that makes to me America is such an appealing place. Is you have enshrined the principle of free speech right in the heart. It's the First Amendment for a reason. It matters, really tremendously matters to your society. And on that issue, no question about it at all. You're absolutely right to pick me up on that, Jag. We're much worse off on that side of things. I hope we can win that battle because, as I say, the more ordinary people start to see this happening, the more pushback there is. But on that issue, you guys are doing much better. And I wish we had a First Amendment.
All right. Well, it's something that I am very grateful for. And you and your partner talk a lot about gratitude. And you mentioned that in your studio, I think that even though you're not religious, you say a kind of secular grace when you're about to eat, even giving thanks for people who made your life difficult in the past. And of course, objectivism is non-mystical and atheistic. So I thought that was really intriguing that you found a way to incorporate this as a ritual, but also in terms of your focus on gratitude more generally, which is a big theme of ours here at the Atlas Society. We talk about gratitude as an envy to as an antidote to envy and to resentment. So how can we help to encourage people to see the personal and social benefits of gratitude? You are naturally positioned to do that because you have this experience of growing up in another country and having had relatives and members of your family that lived and suffered deeply under communism. And so that gives you, as you say, that second sight where you are. But just more general thoughts on gratitude and how we can encourage it.
Yeah, I think that's I'm so glad you asked me that, because I think it's such an important question. And this is actually one of those things that I don't think is anything to do with my background, because I wasn't actually always like this. I wasn't always grateful for the things that I had. I will confess as well, it's a lot easier to be grateful for what you have when your life is great.
Explain
And
better, yeah.
yeah, so from that perspective, I think that's probably part of it. But so for me right now, the idea of gratitude is I really don't want to. I'm really blessed in terms of what's happening with my life. You know, I have a job that I love that allows me to put a roof over my family's heads. I have a 5-month-old, he's about to be 6-month-old baby boy. You know, I have a meaning, I have purpose, I have enough money to survive. Like, what else could a man want? You know, so from that perspective, I just appreciate that so much. And also, you know, we're building something very special with trigonometry, and the process is incredible, and connecting with hundreds of thousands of people around the world, and going on shows like the Joe Rogan Experience, and meeting people that I look up to and learning from them, and being in conversations with all sorts of incredible people who are like super smart and from whom I can learn so much. That was always a huge dream for me, is being around people. Yes, I always like sharing my thoughts, and I know that a lot of them respect my thoughts about certain things and my views of looking at things. But also, it's like, you know, I went for a friend of mine was in town, Chris Williamson from a YouTube channel, Modern Wisdom, and he was in town on his way to do something amazing in Africa, and he had like an 11-hour lay-by in London. And I was like, oh, hey, let me come down, grab you. We'll go to the gym. We'll sit in the sauna. We'll have lunch afterwards. And we spent like 6 or 7 hours together, where like both of us come away from that conversation massively inspired and enlightened, and having learned things and shared things, and given each other advice and support. Like, that's amazing. I don't want to miss that. So the reason that I spend so much time thinking about all these things that I'm grateful for and acknowledge them is I want to be present and notice that they're happening in the moment, and be like, oh wow, this is incredible, rather than being like the way I frankly used to be, where it was like, oh, so what's the next thing? What am I doing next? What have I got tomorrow? What's my, you know, that I think being present naturally is helpful anyway, even if life is difficult, but particularly when life is going well, it's important to be present. So it's not something I picked up from going, oh, let's compare myself to my grandparents in the gulag. It's something I spent a lot of time doing all sorts of personal development, because I've always been interested in squeezing the most out of the resources that I've been given. You know, we all get dealt a certain set of cards. I always wanted to make sure that I was making the most of the cards that I was dealt. And gratitude is a part of every major religion. It's also a part of almost every personal development way of looking at things. If you want to make your life better, being grateful is going to make it better. Because one of the things people don't realize, and this is where, you know, the non-mysticism part of objectivism, I actually have issue with, or at least I disagree with, because I'm quite a mystical person in many ways, because I believe that there are very complicated connections that maybe you can explain logically, but we don't have the tools to do that level of analysis yet. And so they might as well be mystical, in the sense of, if you are grateful for the things that you have in life, that means you come across differently to other people. That affects how they will treat you, whether they will help you, whether they will give you useful advice, whether they will lift you up or push you down. And so if you develop a disposition that makes it more likely that other people are attracted to you and want to work with you and want to help you, then more good things will happen in your life, right? And so even from that sort of you might call that a slightly mystical way of looking at things, but it's just experientially true that being grateful is something that makes your life better, and it makes it more enjoyable. Makes you a more enjoyable person to be around for other people. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would, when I say mystical or supernatural, I am talking about something that doesn't exist in reality.
Yeah.
And what I think you're talking about is the possibility of connections or things that might be unified in ways that we don't have a way of understanding or measuring.
Sure.
So
The reason I say that, Jack, sorry to interrupt, is that I explained it in a lot of detail, whereas I think in any other normal conversation, if we hadn't brought up the mystical, non-mystical, I would have just said your energy is different and other people respond to your energy. Now,
yeah,
is your energy something that exists? I don't know. But I do think there is such a thing as how you are affects how other people are with you. I would think we'd all recognize that.
absolutely. And actually, what you're talking about sounds a lot like the particular kind of objectivism that we promote at the Atlas
Okay.
Society,
Oh, brilliant.
which is open objectivism, and it is very much not just about, hey, this is philosophy and we're going to impose it on you, but being open and entrepreneurial and interested and tolerant to the way that other people may see things or their points of view, and just being open, giving people the benefit of the doubt, believing that there is inherent value to other people, and that if you're open and if you are showing up as somebody who's benevolent and bringing something of value to the table, then you are, even in a self-interested way, you're probably going to be somebody who's going to make the connections that are going to be helpful for you along the way. So,
yeah, well, those are awesome values.
so we like it. It works. All right. Couple of very interesting questions that kind of dovetail a few that I had in the pantry. One of which is something I'm always interested in. We're getting it from Janice on Instagram. You mentioned lockdowns earlier. How was that for you? How did it change your outlook or mental positivity? So you didn't have the opportunity to, hey, we're going to go to Florida. So
yeah. Well, initially lockdown was incredibly good. Because, as I say, I hadn't been spending nearly enough time with my wife, and suddenly we had all this free time, and we'd go for like walks and spend time together and do stuff, and it was incredible. The first lockdown was absolutely fantastic for me personally.
And but I also think, just to interrupt there, that given what we just talked about in terms of gratitude, that is a really healthy. I mean, I think I don't want to whitewash or I'm not ready to move on. I'm not ready to call an amnesty. I think there needs to be
me neither.
ability.
But I've got
I
other
think
things to say on this. Believe me.
And I want to get to that, but that your ability, even in a difficult time, say, hey, this is good, and find positives, and certainly spending time.
Well, it was beyond good. It was absolutely necessary. So I, as someone who later developed a huge aversion to the subsequent lockdowns, there is a part of me that comedically sort of thinks, you know what, a lockdown every 20 years probably would do a lot of people a lot of good. Just like a couple of months where you're not allowed to go to work, you're not allowed to do everything the way you used to, and you just are forced to re-examine your life for a couple of months. Like once every 20 years, that actually might not be a bad thing. Certainly, but you can do your own, I suppose. So, but beyond that, I thought once we got past the first lockdown, once it was, because at the beginning we didn't know what it was. Nobody knew how deadly or not deadly it was going to be. We didn't know how it spread exactly. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe even if we say that lockdown was a mistake, which I at this point would agree probably was a mistake. It was an understandable mistake, in my opinion. But once you get past that, and you know what this is, and you know how it works, and you know how it transmits, and you know that masks don't really work, and you know all this other stuff that we later learned. And when the vaccine comes out, there's a lot of other things that you're told to believe, which later turn out not to be true. People are forced to take it to protect other people, even though the stopping transmission really wasn't strong enough to make that sort of claim at all, right? All of the stuff, I thought we went down a very, very dark path very quickly. And towards the end of it, I literally felt, as someone who is grateful and as someone who had a great job throughout lockdown, once I stopped stand-up, Triggernometry happened to take off massively during that time. It became a full-time job for us. It was great. I was spending that time with my wife and my friends with whom I do the Triggernometry. I had a good time. But by the end of it, I just thought that as a country, or as several countries, we were going down such a dark path when it comes to human freedom, the idea of liberty, the idea of bodily autonomy, which I think happens to be quite important, and all of these other things, that I actually thought we were in an emergency. And I think it was only the development of the Omicron variant in the UK, which was much milder, and the rising tensions to do with the restrictions, those two things combined allowed us to step back from the brink. I think that if COVID had continued to be as lethal as it had been prior to that, I suspect the government would have, certainly in our country, would have carried on attempting to continue to tighten the screws and reduce the amount of freedom of choice that you have and what you are allowed to do, and forcing you to have medical procedures. I mean, they were about to fire I think 70 or 80,000 nurses from the National Health Service who didn't want to take the COVID injection, and this is at a time when the healthcare system is breaking apart because we don't have enough staff, and they were prepared to fire tens of thousands of nurses, doctors, and they did fire social workers or carers in this country, who, again, of whom there's a massive shortage, just to force everybody to take a vaccination that doesn't protect anyone except the person who's taking it. To say nothing of the fact that there were, by this point, millions and millions and millions of people who had natural immunity, who did not need to be vaccinated at all. So initially brilliant. Afterwards, I thought it's as close as we've come to a very, very dark place in our society in the time that I've been alive.
All right. Two questions on subjects I want to make sure that we get to. One is from My Modern Galt on Instagram. Thoughts on Brexit 2 years later?
Well, it's 6 years later since Brexit, isn't it? It happened in 2022. But I voted to stay in the EU, and I was perfectly fine with that position. We don't know how that would have gone exactly. Might have been better, might have been worse. What I was horrified about is people who voted differently to me, who happened to be a small majority at the time, were immediately treated as if they were some sort of second-class citizens because they happened to express a different opinion politically to mine. I always argued from the beginning that we had a vote and we have to accept the results of that vote and proceed accordingly. But it turned out that there were millions of people in this country who simply refused to lose. They had sour grapes and they wanted to continue to express their frustrations about losing in such a way that I thought was disgusting. I thought it was outrageous, the way that they tried to attack people who simply had a different political view as being motivated by the most evil things in human society. It was just outrageous. But in terms of my own opinion, Brexit hasn't been a massive success. I also think it hasn't been a clean experiment because we've had the COVID lockdowns, the war in Ukraine, and all of these other things that obviously have a massive impact on how things are going. So I think it's very hard to judge. It's like, I think it was one of the Chinese leaders was once asked what was his view of the French Revolution, and he said it's too soon to tell. With Brexit, it's definitely too soon to tell.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think it's very early days in how that issue is actually going to play out.
And another basket of questions we're getting on Ukraine and Russia, particularly you have family in both. And so I think you had said at one point that the purpose of what Russia was doing in the Ukraine was to throw the West off its pedestal. Is that correct? And what did you mean by that?
Well, I did say that, but actually there is one other person who said it much better than me, and that's Vladimir Putin. In almost every speech he's given since before the invasion and afterwards. I've translated his last two speeches for my Substack, and you can see from the horse's mouth. In his last speech that he gave at the Valdai Discussion Club, which is essentially like Russia's Davos. It's the Russian equivalent of Davos. They get delegates from all over the world. And he was pitching to them essentially a new world order, which he calls a multipolar world, in which the United States and its allies are not in the position that they're currently in, and that lots of other countries now decide in a sort of what he called democracy. I'm using quotation marks for everybody listening. He was offering them a democratic global order, as he put it. But he one of the things he said in that speech is that the UN Security Council needs to be changed to reflect the fact that, this new arrangement, if you like. So he's deliberately attempting to weaken the West. His entire approach to Ukraine is irredentist, and what he wants is people go, well, Vladimir Putin is not a communist. He's not trying to rebuild the USSR, and I agree, he's not. He's actually trying to rebuild the Russian Empire. He's very critical of Vladimir Lenin, for example, and other revolutionaries who broke up the Russian Empire and created the USSR, because a lot of land was lost in the collapse of the Russian Empire. He would like it to be taken back. This is why he's very critical of the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, because he transferred Ukraine, the Crimea, to the Ukrainian SSSR, and that's basically his entire game. So he wants to rebuild the Russian Empire. He wants a new world order in which America is no longer calling the shots. And the amazing thing to me is people are always asking me this question. I'm not saying you did in this way, but they're like, you're saying this super controversial thing. I'm like, no, guys, it's what Vladimir Putin's saying. Maybe we should listen to the guy who's doing it. Is that controversial? Is that outrageous here? Am I being weird here that I'm saying maybe we should listen to the guy who's doing the invading to find out why he's invading?
And we put that link in the comment sections of the platform, so people should go and check that out. And also, if you haven't already, though it looks like unsurprisingly we have quite a few fans of Triggernometry already in the audience, but I'm curious, how did that podcast start for you? And have you and Francis been friends a long time and just decided to pull this together? Or what was the origin story of Triggernometry?
Well, we were two stand-ups on the comedy circuit, and I became a regular performer at a comedy club that Francis used to help run. So I was there a lot. We talked. I think it became very clear that we were both not on board with a lot of the things that were happening in our industry, because some of the cultural changes you and I have talked about in the course of this conversation were happening in comedy earlier, faster, harder, at a more expanded rate in every way, and it was becoming very apparent that the culture was going in this direction. So it became quite clear that neither of us was particularly on board, and I was looking around at the time. You got to remember, starting a podcast in 2020, everyone's like, oh, another podcast. But back then there was a lot fewer, particularly YouTube shows, and certainly there weren't basically none in the UK at that time. Now there's quite a few doing what we do, and I've been watching people like Joe Rogan, and Dave Rubin was having some interesting conversations at that time, because he was in that kind of, I'm a liberal and I kind of don't really get what's going on. And he was sort of in that place, which I found very interesting, because I always find that much more interesting than people who have like a very clear political, grouping.
Identity.
Yeah, I find that less appealing. But at that point, that's what he was doing, and I found that fascinating. And Joe Rogan's always been having these conversations, and there were a few other people doing it, and I really wanted to do it. That's what interested me, and I thought that Francis would be a good pairing for me, because I can sometimes disappear quite far into the overly intellectual side of things, and he's always going to be there to ask the question that actually most people want to hear the answer to. And so there's a bit of intellectual stuff, and then there's a bit more grounded stuff, and then layer a bit of comedy into it, and then I thought we could do something good. So I suggested it, and Francis he actually had I think our relationship with him is a rebound relationship, you might say, because he'd just been doing a podcast with somebody else, and it was very good. It was a pure comedy podcast, but it didn't work out between the two guys doing it. So I came along and I was like, hey, do you want to do this? And I think he was keen to do something, but he was also a bit raw from his previous experience. But eventually we found a way to make it work, and the rest is history.
Yeah, well, I guess sometimes rebound relationships do work. So. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour. I want to put the cover of Konstantin's book up again, and I again highly recommend the Audible version, especially now that we understand the sacrifices that he went through to write that for us. So any closing thoughts or new projects on the horizon for you?
Yeah, well, there are always new projects. I'm someone who doesn't believe in saying things until I'm ready to sort of commit to them with my word. But I'm always working on new stuff, and I've got some very cool, exciting things that I'll be doing over the next few years. So there's plenty more to come. But in terms of closing thoughts, no, I wanted to say how much I appreciate you having me on. It's been a real pleasure. I think there is so much fighting and anger and destruction and of each other's opinions happening on the internet. Like you and I have had this conversation. The truth is, I have absolutely no idea whether you've agreed with most of what I've said or not. And
most of it, I'd say 85%.
But even if it was 10%, it doesn't really matter, because we had a good conversation. So what does it matter whether you and I agreed on everything? Of course, 15% is a small amount to disagree with me on. 5 years from now, I'll probably disagree with 60% of what I've said today. But I just think the space to have discussions without necessarily feeling like there has to be agreement or disagreement, where we can just have a conversation. I think it's a wonderful and rare thing, and I really appreciate you creating that space for us to talk today.
And it's good practice, because Thanksgiving is coming up, and I'm the only Republican in my family. So
right.
Practicing a bit of open objectivism, as our founder said. If we are wrong, then we have something to learn, and if we are right, then we have nothing to fear. So that's why it is good to be open to talking with people. It is not a sanction to just hear somebody else's point of view, and in return have the opportunity to share yours. So Konstantin, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you, Jag. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And thanks all of you who joined us. Thank you for the excellent questions that you submitted. You make my job easier. If you enjoy the work of the Atlas Society, again, we are a nonprofit, so please consider making a tax-deductible donation at atlassociety.org. And join us next week. I'm going to be interviewing Grover Norquist. As you may recall, he was a guest in maybe the first week of these webinars that we started back during the lockdowns. Dear friend of mine, founder of Americans for Tax Reform, and we're going to be doing a review of the elections and looking at what comes next. So thanks, everybody.